In the annals of history, few victories are so absolute, so total, that they echo through eternity. But what if the greatest triumph of an empire was not an ending, but a beginning? This is the untold saga of how Rome's greatest victory became the genesis of its ultimate nightmare. Before the name Hannibal sent shivers down the spines of Roman senators, two colossal powers vied for control of the known world. In the West, the young, aggressive Republic of Rome, its power forged in the discipline of its legions. In the South, across the sea, the ancient maritime empire of Carthage, its wealth drawn from a vast network of trade. For more than 2 decades, they bled each other dry in a conflict that would be known as the First Punic War. The prize was Sicily, the jewel of the Mediterranean. The cost was staggering: hundreds of thousands of lives, entire fleets swallowed by the sea. For 23 grueling years, the war raged on, a brutal stalemate of attrition. But finally, at the Battle of the Aegates Islands in 241 before Christ, Rome achieved the impossible. They defeated the Carthaginian navy at its own game. The defeat was not just a military loss for Carthage, it was a profound humiliation. Rome imposed a crushing peace. Carthage was forced to abandon Sicily forever. But was the loss of territory the most painful blow? The true poison in this treaty was the indemnity, a sum so vast it would cripple the Carthaginian state for a generation. The empire was brought to its knees, stripped of its pride and its Treia. Yet, in the smoldering ashes of this defeat, something far more dangerous was being forged. Among the Carthaginian commanders was a man named Hannibal Barca. He had fought the Romans with cunning and ferocity, never tasting personal defeat in a major land battle. He watched as his government surrendered, and a fire of pure, unadulterated hatred was lit within him. But how could one man defy the will of the world's new superpower? Legend tells of a solemn ceremony, far from the prying eyes of Rome. Hamilcar led his son, a boy of only 9 years old, to a sacrificial altar. He asked the boy to place his hand upon the offering and swear an oath. Not an oath of loyalty to Carthage, not an oath to the gods, but an oath of eternal, undying enmity to Rome. That boy's name was Hannibal. While Rome celebrated its victory, growing complacent on the spoils of war, Hamilcar took his son and the remnants of his army to Spain. There, in secret, he would carve out a new empire for Carthage, a base of operations from which to plot his revenge. The Romans believed they had won the war. They were wrong. They had only created the monster that would come to haunt their darkest dreams, a specter of vengeance born from a father's rage and a son's sacred promise. This isn't just history. This is the origin story of Rome's ultimate nemesis, forged in a single, powerful promise from a 9-year-old boy. In the smoky haze of a Carthaginian temple, a defeated general named Hannibal Barca brings his son forward. Before the gods and the smoldering altar, young Hannibal places his hand upon the sacrifice. He makes a solemn vow that will echo through eternity to never, ever be a friend to Rome. But how does one boy's promise become a threat to the most powerful republic in the world? Hannibal grows into a man, his mind a razor-sharp weapon honed by years of warfare in Hispania. He watches, he learns, and he waits. When command is thrust upon him, his target is singular, his ambition absolute. Rome must be humbled. Yet Rome is an ocean away, protected by the sea and the impassable peaks of the Alps. The Senate laughs at the notion of a land invasion. They believe They are untouchable. They have no idea what is coming. In the year 218 before Christ, Hannibal does the unthinkable. He gathers an army of nearly 100,000 men and, most famously, 36 war elephants, and begins a march not toward the sea, but toward the sky. The crossing of the Alps is a saga of pure, unyielding will. His men face blizzards, rock slides, and hostile tribes in a nightmare ascent into the heavens. Thousands perish, the beasts of war freezing in the mountain passes. But after 15 days of brutal suffering, a frost-bitten, emaciated army descends into the plains of Italy. They had survived the impossible, but were they now strong enough to challenge a nation of millions on its own soil? The first Roman legions sent to stop him are brushed aside at the battles of Trebia and Lake Trasimene. Hannibal's tactics are revolutionary, his ambushes perfect. He is a phantom on the battlefield, appearing where least expected and vanishing after inflicting devastating losses. Rome is gripped by a terror it has never known. In response, they gather the largest army the Republic has ever fielded. More than 80,000 soldiers, a wave of steel and fury meant to crush the Carthaginian invader once and for all. At a small village named Cannae, the two forces meet. The Roman commanders, seeing Hannibal's intentionally weakened center, order a full frontal assault. Confident they can shatter his lines with sheer force, they charge forward, smelling victory. They have no idea they are walking into the jaws of the greatest tactical trap in military history. Hannibal allows his center to buckle, drawing the Romans deeper and deeper into a pocket. Then, as the trap springs shut, his elite cavalry smashes into the Roman rear, and his infantry envelops them from both sides. The result is not a battle. It is an annihilation. In a single day, as many as 70,000 Romans are slaughtered. The Republic is on its knees, its armies destroyed, its spirit broken. But then Hannibal hesitates. He has won his masterpiece, yet he does not march on the city of Rome itself. Why? For over a decade, Hannibal remains a terrifying presence in Italy, a master of a war he cannot seem to win outright. Lacking siege equipment and support from a wary Carthage, he can only bleed the Republic, not kill it. Meanwhile, Rome learns. A new general, Scipio, studies Hannibal's methods, adapting them, preparing for the final, inevitable confrontation. Recalled to Africa to defend his homeland, Hannibal prepares for his last great battle. At Zama, he faces Scipio's legions, a Roman army that now fights with the same tactical flexibility and brilliance that Hannibal himself had taught them. The master now faces his own reflection. The battle is a titanic struggle, but in the end, the student surpasses the teacher. Hannibal is defeated. His long war is over. Hunted by the Romans for the rest of his days, he lives as an exile, a king without a country, a general without an army. But even in the end, facing capture, he holds true to his oath. He takes his own life, denying Rome the satisfaction of parading their greatest enemy through their streets. Hannibal Barca lost the war, but he defined an age. He brought the Roman Republic to the very brink of collapse, and in doing so, forged it into the hardened, relentless empire it would become. The promise made by a 9-year-old boy at a smoky altar was kept. His entire life was an act of war against Rome, a vow fulfilled in blood, fire, and legendary genius. They called him insane. He called it strategy. This is the story of Hannibal's crossing of the Alps, a suicidal masterpiece. The year is 218 before Christ. The Mediterranean is a Roman lake, its fleets dominant, its power absolute. Carthage, humbled in the First Great War, now has a new champion, Hannibal Barca, a man forged in the fires of vengeance, sworn since childhood to be an enemy of Rome. But with the seas blocked and Rome's legions guarding the coasts, how could he ever hope to strike at the heart of the Republic? His generals called it madness. His advisers pleaded for caution. Hannibal's gaze, however, was fixed not on the sea, but on the horizon, on the towering, impassable peaks of the Alps. He would not sail. He would march over the mountains with an army of tens of thousands and beasts of war never before seen in those highlands, the mighty war elephants. It was a gamble that defied all military logic, a path no sane commander would ever consider. But what if the very insanity of the plan was its greatest strength? The ascent began. A column of over 50,000 soldiers, 9,000 cavalry, and 37 elephants snaked its way into the unforgiving mountain passes. Almost immediately, the Alps began to claim their price. The air grew thin, the cold bit deep into bone, and the paths narrowed to treacherous ledges over bottomless chasms. But the mountain itself was not their only enemy. Hostile Gallic tribes, seeing this rich army as prey, launched brutal ambushes from the cliffs above, raining down boulders and arrows. How long could his army endure before it simply broke apart under the strain? After 9 days of relentless climbing and fighting, they reached the summit. But there was no relief. Before them lay a descent even more terrifying than the climb, a wall of fresh snow and slick ice. Men and animals slipped, plunging into the abyss. The elephants, terrified and unsuited for the icy terrain, became living, battering rams of chaos. Hannibal stood on a precipice, watching his grand army disintegrate. Was this the end of the great Carthaginian hope? But Hannibal was more than a general. He was a force of will. He rallied his men, ordering them to cut a new path through the ice and rock itself. For 3 days they labored, fueled by little more than their commander's unbreakable resolve. Finally, they emerged. Broken, starving, and frozen, they stumbled into the plains of Italy. Of the 50,000 men who began the journey, fewer than half remained. Of the 37 elephants, only a handful survived. The cost was staggering, a price that would have broken any other commander. But Hannibal looked upon his battered force not with despair, but with grim satisfaction. He had done the impossible. He had brought the war to Rome's doorstep. The Alpine gambit was complete, and the most terrifying phase of the Second Punic War was just beginning. The Alps, impassable, a fortress of ice and stone, guarded by nature's fury, until one man dared to defy it all. What happened when he descended from those peaks? Rome would never be the same. He emerged from the frozen hell of the mountains, a ghost leading an army of phantoms. Of the nearly 60,000 men and 37 war elephants that began the climb, fewer than half remained, a starving, frost-bitten shadow of the force that had left Spain. The Romans, confident in their mountain shield, were caught completely off guard. How could this be possible? An army had just materialized in their backyard, a predator loose among the flock. But this was Hannibal Barca, a man forged in hatred for Rome, sworn to vengeance since he was a boy of 9. He did not wait. He did not rest. At the river Ticinus, he struck, a swift, brutal taste of the storm to come, where the Roman commander himself was nearly killed. Rome, shaken but arrogant, sent a larger force. At the river Trebia, on a bitterly cold December morning in 218 before Christ, Hannibal laid his first great trap. He lured the overeager Romans across the freezing river, and as they engaged, a hidden force of 2,000 men slammed into their rear. It was a slaughter. Tens of thousands of Romans were cut down. But could Hannibal sustain this momentum against the full might of the Republic? Winter passed. Hannibal moved again, not where the Romans expected, but through the treacherous, flooded Arno marshes. For 4 days and 3 nights, his army waded through chest-deep water, a nightmarish march that cost Hannibal the sight in one eye. He emerged once more where he should not have been, and the new consul, Gaius Flaminius, a man of impulsive pride, gave chase. On the morning of June 21st, 217 before Christ, Flaminius marched his entire army into a narrow defile along the shores of Lake Trasimene, shrouded in a thick morning fog. He had no idea that Hannibal's entire army was hidden on the hillsides above, watching, waiting. What happened in that fog would become the largest ambush in military history. The signal was given. The Carthaginian forces descended from all sides. The fog that had blinded the Romans now became their tomb. There was no battle line, only chaos and death. 15,000 Romans were killed. Another 15,000 were captured. Rome had lost another entire consular army. Panic gripped the city. The gates were barred, the walls manned. The question on every Roman's lips was not if Hannibal would attack the city, but when. Rome was on its knees. They turned to one man, Quintus Fabius Maximus, appointing him dictator. His strategy was radical, infuriating. He would not fight Hannibal. He would shadow him, starve him, deny him the glorious battle he craved. But for a people raised on martial glory, this was cowardice. The Pres in Rome would get its battle, a battle that would take place on the dusty plains of a place called Cannae, and would etch Hannibal's name into history forever as the master of annihilation. They called it impossible, a single general against an empire's might. The result? A military masterpiece of pure destruction. In the year 216 before Christ, a shadow loomed over the Roman Republic. This shadow had a name, Hannibal Barca. For 2 years, the Carthaginian general had rampaged through Italy, leaving a trail of broken legions in his wake. Rome, the proud heart of a burgeoning empire, was bleeding. But how could one man defy the most powerful military machine the world had ever known? Stung by humiliating defeats, the Senate made a fateful decision. They would not outmaneuver Hannibal. They would obliterate him. They resolved to raise the largest army in Roman history, an unprecedented force of over 80,000 men. 2 consuls were given command, but their divided leadership would prove to be a fatal flaw. Could even Hannibal stand against such overwhelming numbers? The stage was set on the sun-scorched plains of Apulia, near a small village called Cannae. The Roman legions advanced, a sea of steel and crimson, their discipline and sheer numbers a terrifying spectacle. Hannibal watched them come. His own army outnumbered nearly 2 to 1. To any other general, this would have been the end. But Hannibal did not see an army. He saw an opportunity. He knew the Roman psyche, their reliance on the brute force of their heavy infantry. He would use their greatest strength against them. On the morning of August 2nd, he arranged his forces in a formation that defied all military convention. It looked weak, almost like an invitation to attack. Was this a desperate gamble, or the opening move in a trap of unimaginable scale? The Romans took the bait. The legions surged forward, crashing into Hannibal's thin center line. The line bent. It buckled. It began to give way, retreating slowly, deliberately, drawing the Romans deeper and deeper into the jaws of the beast. The Romans roared in triumph, sensing victory, blind to the doom that was closing in around them. And then the trap snapped shut. On the flanks, Hannibal's elite cavalry shattered their Roman counterparts. At the same time, his veteran African infantry, held in reserve on the wings, pivoted inward, slamming into the exposed sides of the packed Roman formation. Suddenly, the hunters had become the hunted. The final piece fell into place as Hannibal's cavalry returned, charging into the rear of the now surrounded legions. The encirclement was complete. There was no battle line. There was no retreat. There was only a killing field. For 8 hours, the slaughter continued under the brutal summer sun. When the dust settled, the field of Cannae was a vision of hell. As many as 70,000 Romans lay dead, including a consul and 80 senators. It was the Republic's darkest day, a catastrophe on a scale that was simply unimaginable. Hannibal had achieved the impossible, using the Romans' own power to fuel their destruction. For over 2,000 years, commanders would study his methods, seeking to replicate the deadly elegance of his double envelopment. He stood victorious on that bloody field, having broken the sword of Rome. But he had not broken its spirit. Hannibal had won the battle, but the question remained, could he ever truly win the war? This wasn't just a strategy. This was Rome looking death in the eye and turning it into an endless, agonizing chase. The year is 217 before Christ. The fields of Italy are stained with Roman blood. The ghosts of tens of thousands of fallen legionaries whisper on the wind, and one man, Hannibal Barca, stands as a colossus, seemingly moments away from shattering the Republic forever. But Rome would not break, not yet. In the face of such a predator, any other power would have knelt. They would have sued for peace, offered tribute, anything to stop the bleeding. But this was Rome, and for the Romans, defeat was merely a lesson, not an end. The Senate, reeling from the catastrophes at Trebia and Lake Trasimene, made a decision that would defy every convention of ancient warfare. A decision so radical it was seen by many as cowardice. They chose a man whose greatest weapon would not be the sword, but patience. His name was Quintus Fabius Maximus. History would call him Cunctator, the delayer. His mandate was simple yet profound. Do not fight Hannibal. Under any circumstances, do not meet him on an open field. Instead, Fabius would become Hannibal's shadow. His legions would stalk the Carthaginian army from the hills, a constant menacing presence that refused to descend and give battle. They would pick off scouts, ambush foraging parties, and bleed his army one small cut at a time. For Hannibal, a man who lived for the thunder of the charge and the grand decisive clash of steel, this was a special kind of hell. How do you kill an enemy who refuses to die, but also refuses to fight? The master of the battlefield was being turned into a ghost, haunting the Italian countryside with a magnificent army that could find no one to crush. He laid waste to farmlands, burned villages, all in a desperate attempt to provoke a response, to force the Romans out of the hills. But Fabius held his nerve, watching, waiting, always just out of reach. Back in Rome, however, patience was wearing thin. The people clamored for action. Senators denounced Fabius as a coward, his strategy a stain on Roman honor. They were about to get their wish, and it would lead to Rome's darkest day. The Senate, bowing to popular fight, they amassed the largest army Rome had ever fielded, over 80,000 men, and marched to finally crush Hannibal at a place called Cannae. What followed was not a battle. It was an extermination, a masterclass in tactical genius from Hannibal, and the single most catastrophic defeat in Roman history. In one afternoon, the strategy of the delayer was horrifically vindicated. In the bloody aftermath, with the Republic on the brink of total collapse, Rome had to make a choice: revert to the hated strategy of avoidance or cease to exist. Chastened, bleeding, but unbroken, Rome turned once more to the ghost of Fabius's plan. The Shield of Rome, they would later call it. For another decade, Hannibal would march through Italy, a king without a kingdom, a conqueror with nothing left to conquer. The Fabian strategy denied him the one thing he needed to win: a final, war-ending victory. It was a war of attrition that Rome, with its vast resources and unbreakable will, was destined to win. By refusing to fight the decisive battle in Italy, Rome bought the time to forge the very general, Scipio Africanus, who would finally defeat Hannibal, not in Italy, but on the plains of Africa. This was the ultimate lesson of the Fabian strategy. Sometimes the greatest courage is not found in the charge, but in the refusal to charge. It is the wisdom to know that to win a war, you must first survive it. And Rome was the ultimate survivor. In the heart of a blood-soaked Italy, the specter of Hannibal Barca loomed over Rome. For over a decade, he had ravaged their lands, a ghost they could not catch, a nightmare they could not wake from. The Republic was bleeding, its legions shattered, its spirit teetering on the brink of collapse. But while the Carthaginian genius was bogged down, a world away from his home, a young Roman noble was not just planning revenge, he was preparing to invade hell itself. His name was Publius Cornelius Scipio, and he had a destiny forged in fire and loss. He had witnessed the horror of Cannae, seen his father and uncle fall to Carthaginian steel in Spain, but where others saw only despair, Scipio saw a blueprint. He devoured Hannibal's tactics, not as a student fears a master, but as a predator studies its prey. He understood a terrible truth that the old guard of Rome refused to see. To defeat the monster, you had to become the monster. He stood before the terrified Roman Senate, a body of old, cautious men, and proposed the unthinkable. "Do not fight Hannibal here," he urged, his voice ringing with a conviction that bordered on madness. "Let us take the war to Carthage. Let us make them feel the sting of invasion." It was a gamble of apocalyptic proportions. To strip Italy of its last defenders and sail into the heart of the enemy's empire, it was suicide. Or was it the stroke of a genius so profound it could change the course of history forever? The Senate, hesitant but desperate, gave him his command. But they did not give him their best legions. No, he was given the outcasts, the disgraced survivors of the Battle of Cannae, men branded with shame, their armor a constant reminder of Rome's greatest defeat. But Scipio saw not disgrace, but a fire waiting to be rekindled. He was building Hannibal's nightmare, using Roman hands. The year was 204 before Christ. Scipio's fleet appeared off the coast of Africa. For the first time in generations, the soil of the Carthaginian homeland felt the tread of an invading army. Panic gripped the great city. The wealth, the power, the safety they had known for centuries, it all seemed to be dissolving into thin air. They had only one answer, one final desperate hope to save them from the Roman wolf at their door. They sent the Raven, a message flying across the sea to Italy, carrying a single, desperate command: "Come home, Hannibal." And so the stage was set. On the dusty plains of Zama, two of the greatest military minds the world would ever know would finally meet. On one side, Hannibal Barca, the aging lion, the undefeated conqueror, now forced to defend his own home. On the other, Scipio, the young eagle, the prodigy who had learned every lesson his master had to teach and then invented a few of his own. This was more than a battle. It was the clash of titans, the culmination of a 17-year war that had consumed the lives of hundreds of thousands. It was the final bloody chapter in a saga that would determine the fate of the Mediterranean and the world. Hannibal thought he was untouchable. He thought Rome was his. Then a chilling message arrived. Carthage is burning. For 15 long years, the name Hannibal Barca was a specter haunting the Roman Republic. He had crossed the Alps, shattered legions, and brought the eternal city to its knees. But in the shadows of Rome's despair, a new champion was forged in the fires of defeat. A young general named Publius Cornelius Scipio. He understood a terrible truth. You could not defeat Hannibal by fighting him on his own terms in Italy. So how could one man possibly hope to outwit the undisputed master of war? Scipio's strategy was not just bold, it was borderline insane. He proposed to take the war directly to the enemy's heart, to invade North Africa itself. The Roman Senate was aghast, calling it a reckless fool's errand, leaving Rome defenseless. But Scipio saw the true weakness in Hannibal's seemingly invincible position, his home. Scipio would not be deterred assembling an army to force Carthage into making an impossible choice. But could he even get that army across the treacherous Mediterranean Sea? With a force cobbled together from disgraced survivors and loyal volunteers, Scipio set sail, a Roman dagger aimed at the throat of Carthage. His arrival sent a shock wave of panic through the city. The Carthaginian elite, who had funded the war from afar, now heard the tramp of Roman boots outside their own walls. Scipio began a systematic campaign of destruction, allying with local tribes and crushing Carthaginian forces, making it clear this was a conquest. Carthage was hemorrhaging, its grip on Africa slipping. They had only one card left to play, one desperate final gambit. The summons was sent. A ship raced across the sea, carrying a message that would change the course of history. It found Hannibal in Italy, the undefeated conqueror, and delivered the devastating news: come home. His life's work, his entire strategic masterpiece, was unraveling because of one Roman general's audacity. The stage was now set. The two greatest generals of the age were on a collision course, and the fate of the ancient world would be decided not in Italy, but on the dusty plains of Africa. This was Scipio's genius. He turned Hannibal's own strategy against him, bringing fire to the heart of Carthage just as Hannibal had brought terror to the gates of Rome. The man who would become known as Scipio Africanus did more than save his city. He proved that even against the most invincible foe, a brilliant mind and unyielding courage could turn the very tide of history itself. He had conquered a continent. For 15 years, he was the specter that haunted Rome, a name whispered in fear in the very heart of the Republic. But now Hannibal Barca was being called home. He was leaving Italy not in triumph, but in retreat, and it was all because of one man, a man who had studied his every move, learned from his every victory, and was now waiting for him on the sun-scorched plains of Africa. The stage was set in the year 202 before Christ. Two of the greatest military minds in human history were about to collide in a battle that would not just decide a war, but would determine the fate of civilization for the next 1,000 years. On one side, Hannibal, the aging lion, with his hardened veterans of the Italian campaign. On the other, Publius Cornelius Scipio, the young Roman prodigy who had dared to take the war to Carthage itself. The fate of empires rested on their shoulders. As the armies deployed near Zama, the tension was a physical presence. Hannibal had a plan. He always had a plan. He unleashed his ultimate weapon, 80 war elephants, a living, breathing avalanche of terror designed to smash the Roman legions before the battle had even truly begun. But Scipio had a plan of his own. He had not come to Africa to be intimidated. As the colossal beasts charged, the Roman horns blared a terrifying, unfamiliar sound. The legions parted, creating channels of death as javelins rained down from all sides. The trump card had become a catastrophe. Panicked and enraged, the elephants turned, crashing back through Hannibal's own cavalry, sowing chaos and fear. Hannibal's opening move had failed in the most spectacular way possible, but the battle was just beginning. Now came the true test, the clash of steel. Hannibal's seasoned mercenaries and veterans, the men who had bled with him at Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae, slammed into Scipio's disciplined legions. The fighting was savage, a grinding, brutal stalemate where inches were paid for in blood. For a moment, it seemed Hannibal's sheer tactical genius might still carry the day, his infantry slowly, inexorably pushing the Romans back. But Scipio's cavalry, having routed their Carthaginian counterparts, had not simply given chase. They were returning. In a moment of chilling, perfect irony, Scipio unleashed Hannibal's own signature tactic against him. The Roman horsemen smashed into the rear of Hannibal's unsuspecting army. The hammer had met the anvil. The pincer closed. It was Cannae, in reverse. It was checkmate. Hannibal, the man who could not be beaten, saw his army, his life's work, and his sacred oath to destroy Rome all disintegrate around him. He escaped the slaughter, a legend finally broken. He had met the one man who could not only match his genius, but who had learned from it, perfected it, and ultimately surpassed it. In the dust of Zama, one empire was destined to fall, and another was destined to rule the world. And two great generals would be forever linked by that single, fateful day. The most feared general in history, cornered. But his final escape was not through battle. It was a choice that shocked the world. For decades, one name had struck terror into the heart of the Roman Republic: Hannibal Barca. He was the nightmare that haunted their children's sleep, the military genius who had annihilated their legions on their own soil. But after the devastating defeat at the Battle of Zama, the great Carthaginian was no longer a conqueror. He was a fugitive. Rome, scarred and vengeful, could not rest while he drew breath. Their decree echoed across the Mediterranean: Hannibal must be delivered to us. He was forced to flee his own city, the very home he had fought his entire life to defend. So began one of the greatest manhunts in the ancient world, a desperate chase across land and sea. But where could the most wanted man on earth possibly hide? Hannibal journeyed east, to the court of King Antiochus III of the Seleucid Empire, he offered the king a gift beyond price: his own mind, a lifetime of experience in warring against the Roman machine. He proposed a new grand strategy, a second front to crush the Republic once and for all. But the king was wary, suspicious of the Carthaginians' towering fame, and this hesitation would prove to be a fatal mistake. When Rome inevitably crushed Antiochus, Hannibal was on the run once more. He became a ghost, flitting between the courts of minor kings, a legend without a home, a dangerous guest for any who offered him shelter. For years he dodged Roman agents and assassins, always one step ahead, his mind still as sharp as a blade. He even found himself in Bithynia serving King Prusius, and in one final flash of brilliance won a naval battle by launching earthenware pots filled with venomous snakes onto enemy ships. But even his genius could not outrun the long arm of Rome forever. In the year 183 before Christ, after nearly 2 decades of flight, the hunt was finally over. A Roman envoy arrived at the court of King Prusius with an ultimatum: surrender Hannibal, or face the wrath of Rome. The king, a man of little courage, buckled. Roman soldiers surrounded Hannibal's villa. Every escape route was cut off. The lion was finally caged. Hannibal, now an old man of around 67, looked out at the soldiers, sealing his fate. He knew what awaited him in Rome: a humiliating parade in chains, followed by a squalid public execution. It was the ultimate degradation for the man who had made a mockery of their power for so long. But Hannibal had been preparing for this day for years. He held in his hand a small ring, one he had carried through all his years of exile, and inside that ring was his final defiant strategy. He would not give Rome the satisfaction. With his final words, he is said to have scorned the Romans for their dishonorable obsession with the death of one old, hunted man. Then he drank the poison. Hannibal Barca died not as a captive, but as a free man, on his own terms. He denied his enemies their ultimate prize, cementing his legacy not just as a brilliant general, but as an eternal symbol of defiance against impossible odds. His war with Rome was over, but his legend was just beginning. Imagine a mind so brilliant his military genius still shapes wars today. 2,000 years later, he was the monster that haunted the dreams of Roman children, the specter at the gates, the man who brought the world's greatest empire to its very knees. But his story is not just one of conquest. It is a tale of a sacred promise, an impossible journey, and a resolve forged in the fires of eternal hatred. This is the story of Hannibal Barca. In the 3rd century before Christ, the Mediterranean was a chessboard for 2 titans: the burgeoning Roman Republic and the mighty seafaring empire of Carthage. Their first war had ended in a bitter defeat for the Carthaginians, a humiliation that planted the seeds of a vengeance that would span a generation. It was in this shadow that a father, Hannibal Barca, brought his 9-year-old son Hannibal to a sacrificial altar. There he made the boy swear an oath, a solemn vow to never be a friend to Rome. This was not a childhood promise. It was a destiny Hannibal would pursue with a terrifying single-mindedness that would shake the foundations of the known world. Years later, a man forged by that oath, Hannibal now commanded Carthage's armies in Iberia. He honed his skills, tested his strategies, and built a fighting force loyal not to Carthage, but to him. Rome watched, uneasy, as his power grew. They sent envoys, they issued warnings, but they fundamentally misunderstood the man they were dealing with. For Hannibal was not planning to defend, he was planning to attack. And his plan was one of such breathtaking audacity, it bordered on madness. He would not sail the seas his ancestors had mastered. No, he would do the unthinkable. He would take his army, including dozens of war elephants, and march them over the frozen, treacherous peaks of the Alps, directly into Italy. It was a feat no army had ever accomplished. His advisers begged him to reconsider. His rivals called him insane. But Hannibal's will was absolute. The march began with over 50,000 men, a testament to his charisma and leadership. But the mountains themselves became an enemy. Avalanches swept away entire columns. Vicious mountain tribes launched relentless ambushes from the cliffs above. Men and animals froze in the biting cold, falling into icy chasms, their screams swallowed by the wind. What kind of man could lead his followers through such a living hell? After 15 days of unimaginable suffering, a fraction of his army, battered and frostbitten, descended into the plains of Italy. He had lost nearly half his men and most of his elephants. But he had done it. He was in the heart of the enemy. Rome, panicked and enraged, sent their legions confident they would crush this depleted, half-starved invader. They had no idea they were marching into the jaws of a master tactician. At the Battle of the Trebia, Hannibal used the freezing river and a hidden ambush to annihilate a consular army. At Lake Trasimene, he trapped another Roman force against the water's edge in a dense fog, orchestrating a perfect ambush on a scale never seen before. In a matter of months, 2 Roman armies had been utterly destroyed. Rome was terrified. They turned to a new strategy, one of delay and harassment, led by a man named Fabius Maximus. The cunctator, the delayer, for a time it worked. Fabius shadowed Hannibal, refusing to be drawn into a pitched battle, seeking to starve his army into submission. But the Roman people demanded a decisive victory. They called Fabius a coward. They assembled the largest army in their history, 8 legions, nearly 80,000 men, and sent them to crush Hannibal once and for all at a place called Cannae. It would be the ultimate test of Roman power against Carthaginian genius. On that fateful day, Hannibal faced a force almost double his own. He intentionally placed his weakest troops in the center, allowing the massive Roman formation to push them back. The Roman commanders thought they were winning, urging their men deeper and deeper into the Carthaginian line. But it was all a trap of a scale and elegance that military historians still study in awe. As the Roman center advanced, Hannibal's elite African infantry, held on the flanks, swung inward. His cavalry, having already routed their Roman counterparts, slammed into the rear. The Roman army was completely surrounded. What followed was not a battle, but a methodical extermination. Tens of thousands of the Republic's finest were cut down. By sunset, the field of Cannae was a sea of blood. Rome had suffered the single most catastrophic defeat in its history. The path to the city itself lay open. His generals urged him, "March on Rome." But Hannibal hesitated. Why? Why did the man who had sacrificed everything to get to this point stop at the very threshold of victory? The truth was, Hannibal had won the battle, but he had not won the war. He lacked the siege equipment and the political support from Carthage to take the city. For more than a decade, he would remain a terrifying presence in Italy, a master without a kingdom, winning battle after battle, but unable to land the final killing blow. And all the while, Rome was learning. A young general, Scipio, studied Hannibal's tactics. He took the war to Carthage itself, forcing Hannibal to finally abandon Italy to defend his homeland. On the plains of Zama in North Africa, the two greatest generals of the age would finally meet, the student versus the master. This time, it was Scipio who sprung the trap. Using Hannibal's own tactics against him, he neutralized the war elephants and shattered the Carthaginian lines. For the first and last time in a major battle, Hannibal was decisively beaten. Though his empire fell and he died in exile, hunted by the Romans to his last breath, Hannibal's name became eternal. He was the man who made Rome tremble. He was the mind whose strategies at Cannae became the textbook definition of perfect victory, studied by Napoleon, by Patton, by every great commander who came after. 2,000 years later, his story is not just a memory, it is a lesson in the power of a singular, unwavering will, a testament to a mind that could envision the impossible, and a solemn reminder that even the greatest empires can be brought to the brink by the genius of one man.